Welcome. Really happy to see everyone here today to sort of launch our inaugural exhibition dedicated to the North Texas graduate program called Open University, and curated by Matthew Higgs with the help of curatorial fellow Abby Bryant, both of whom join me today. This exhibition, I think for me, feels like the result of a couple decades of complaining. It's really wonderful to see our students that are making work here in the DFW area represented in museum space. I think museums at their best provide space they build bridges between groups of people. So I think in terms of audience, that's maybe where we see that happen the most. They bring people of all sorts into a shared space. So we have people from all demographic groups and walks of life, and tourists and foreigners and strangers come into museum spaces all the time. And museums, are able to make that a very egalitarian place for all those groups to exist. I think where museums often fail, and I will be clear that I don't think every single museum should do this or that it's the requirement, but there are some that should and don't. They don't often show the work of the kind of the unfamous, the unknown, or the artists that are just emerging out of that own location. So I think for Dallas Contemporary, this is a very special thing because at the museum's founding nearly 50 years ago, it was started as an art space by artists for artists. And I think over the years, as its ambition has grown, it's occasionally lost sight of that core founding principle. And so to do this exhibition now is really a return to our foundation as a museum, as a Kunsthalle. So just to describe to you what this show is and how it came about, we sort of hatched this plan to give over space to a group of grad students from the MFAs in North Texas, so Denton, Fort Worth, and Dallas. I invited a curator, Matthew, who very openly, willingly, and with great curiosity accepted the invitation as the inaugural curator. Invited Matthew to come down and spend 3 days in all of the studios of the third-year MFA students in Fort Worth, Denton, and Dallas. So 6 schools total, 29 students in 3 days. It was a act of endurance and great patience, and he did it with total energy and generosity, and really helped, I think, shape the architecture of this program going forward. The result of those studio visits was the development of a cohort. He chose 13 students representing all 6 schools, and that cohort then worked with Matthew and Abby to shape the exhibition that is in our adjacent gallery. A really diverse group of works, but a lot of synergy and energy between them, sort of, I don't think some of it was intentional, some of it was, but just sort of that serendipity of smashing things together in the same place that happens when you make an exhibition. Alongside the exhibition, there is a prize that is given to one of the students, which will be announced later today at a private reception for the artists in the show. That's an $8,000 prize to sort of seed their first year out of graduate school and help them have a foundation that will, allow them to make art, which is a really hard thing to choose to do. I'll say that, for myself, this program matters because I was an MFA student at TCU 11 years ago. I had 3 little kids. I had to drive back and forth to Fort Worth and Dallas every day. I had to pick my kids up from school. I had to go back. It was a ton of work and effort. And the thought of leaving grad school and going back into the world, that $8,000 from a prize like that would have been absolutely transformative. So we know that there's that hope with this, that it's an investment in one of these artists' careers as they choose to go on. The third part of this program is Abby's role, which is curatorial fellow. This all was made possible by Anne McReynolds and her husband John, who are on our board and funded this program for 5 years, and understood that part of the beauty of the project was that we could also encourage an art history student. Abby's getting her master's in art history from TCU with a focus on contemporary art, and she'll talk more about that in a minute. But to allow Abby to learn the tools of the trade from the soup to nuts of making exhibition happen. She came onto our team at a very fraught time during the summer when there was leadership transition, and she stepped in to largely fill my role in overseeing the program, and she's done it absolutely effortlessly, and so I applaud her for that. It's been essential to have her, and she's done it with such grace, so thank you, Abby. So I'm going to open this up to conversation because that's why we're all sitting here. I'm going to say that partly why Matthew is the perfect pick for this project is that he's the director and chief curator at White Columns in New York, which is a 50-year-old, more than that, nonprofit art space. And Matthew's time there has been really largely to give space to artists for their first shows. He's deeply curious and unprejudiced in his view of what art is and the ways it can be found and sought out and praised. And so this really, he felt like the perfect person with the proper amount of humility to approach this scene and this project without any snobbery or exclusivity. So, and he's done that. So, Matthew, I just wondered if you could talk a bit about the initial invitation to do this program, why you said yes, and maybe what your reservations were, if any, when you started.
Hi, everyone. Lucia invited me to organize this exhibition, I think in September.
Yeah, I think I asked you in May. It was May before we announced.
Oh, we formalized it in September, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And I immediately said yes, and without thinking about it too much, because it struck me then, and it still strikes me now, as just an extremely good idea. And in many respects, it seems like a really straightforward and obvious idea, apart from the fact that it never happens anywhere else. It's extraordinarily rare to see the work of graduate students, any stage in their program, in public institutions. I think part of the resistance to that, some of which I think is reasonable, is that institutions, by and large, run on consensus. And of course, what we have here in this exhibition is work where zero consensus exists yet. So the only people who really spent time with this work are the people that made it and the people who teach on those programs and the peers inside those kind of campus settings. So I was very interested in the idea of making a public exhibition of work that up until this point was essentially private. And it seems to me that's kind of like an interesting threshold where a general audience or a broader audience can get to see work that is developing, that's in flux, that hasn't settled, that hasn't been defined, that hasn't been written about. And it seems to me it's quite a liberating moment, time, opportunity to spend time with an object, a thing, a painting, a sculpture, and make your own minds up. And I think for me that just seemed like an interesting idea. The fact that it was being supported by the Reynolds for 5 years also seemed really important to me, that if this was a one-off and regardless of whether it worked or not, I think it would have been frustrating if it just sort of ended at the end of this exhibition. But the fact that it was happening over at least 5 times, 5 different curators will visit Dallas and visit the studios of the subsequent generations of grad students and make different exhibitions. And so I was kind of also interested in doing the inaugural exhibition. And it didn't really occur to me that there might be any pressure on organizing the inaugural exhibition. But the more I spent time with the idea, there were like some concerns. And the concerns really would be that I came to Dallas, which I did in October. I spent 3 days doing 30 studio visits. And I think there's a reasonable possibility that none of the work would have resonated with me. I don't think that's an unreasonable assumption or idea. So that was one concern, that we wouldn't have a show. And perhaps even more than that, there was a concern that, in fact, maybe just two artists might resonate with me, and we'd have to put two artists in a space this big, which might actually be worse than no show. But that's not how it worked out. I ended up inviting 13 artists to participate in the show, artists from all 6 programs, which wasn't a condition at all. In fact, there were no conditions. It could have been 3 artists from one program, one from another, and so on. But I was very happy that all of the schools are represented, because it seems to me, at least for the first exhibition, that it's representative, that each of the different programs and each of their very different kind of way of delivering the programs are represented. And I think from the beginning, I didn't think of it as a group show. In fact, I never thought of it as a group show, because it seemed to me that to try and apply kind of sort of curatorial pressure on the work to somehow make sense together, I think would have been inappropriate. I don't know the artists well enough. I didn't spend enough time in their studios. I don't know the work. So really I see it as 13 autonomous presentations that are happening simultaneously. And I think within that, when we started to install the show, some really interesting conversations started amongst discrete bodies of work and individual artists. And that was sort of a nice part of this revelatory part of the process of installing the show. In terms of how the show's laid out, when I did the studio visits, I took a lot of notes, like written notes. I also took photographs of everybody I met and general shots of their studio to remind me of where I've been. And from that, developed this group of 13 artists, and then started to think about how do you make an exhibition in such unforgiving spaces as this. These are really difficult spaces to put art in. And obviously, if you're in Dallas, you've probably seen a lot of exhibitions here. I haven't, so I don't really know how these spaces are used or how they're occupied. But it seemed clear to me that we had to build some kind of architecture of a kind in order to create a way for the show to reveal itself as you make your passage through it. Because certainly when I came to Dallas Contemporary for the first time, and you turn this corner, you see the whole show at once. You see everything simultaneously. And I don't think that would have made sense for this show. So we developed these sort of walls that are not exactly walls. They're like room dividers, and they're essentially a wooden frame around which Muslim has been stretched. And I felt that they would have a kind of lightness to them without it being physical architecture, without them being kind of literal walls. There's a kind of sense of transparency to them, and there's also a sense of lightness to them, so they don't sort of overwhelm the individual works. But it would also create zones where individual artists could present their work. Some artists are represented by a single work, some are represented by several works, and some artists are represented by something more akin to an installation. This really just came out of my experience of spending time with people in their studios. Certain individual works just stuck with me, and they're representative, I hope, of the larger body of work of those artists. Other artists had really kind of intense, immersive, almost like claustrophobic working spaces, and we hope to try and sort of reanimate that in an exhibition to whatever extent we could. But together, I think it's a really compelling account of my time in Dallas in the studios in October. I think it's very reflective and representative of my experience. And I think, with Abby's help on the show and Lucia and the team here at DC, I think it's a really compelling exhibition. I think it's, again, to go back to my sort of initial thought about this point in time when we're seeing this work, I always say that when I used to teach at grad schools, which I did a lot in the 90s in London, at Goldsmiths and the Royal College of Art, an interesting thing to do is look at an established artist whose work you really like, and then look at what they were doing at grad school, and they're completely different ideas. So somehow they make the work at grad school, they leave grad school, they continue their practice, but as they move forward, it's almost like a leaving behind of the things that they were doing at school. And that interests me too. So I think the way that I described it on the short curatorial text is that I'm as interested in the potential of these works and these artists as I am in the works themselves. And I think the works occupy this sort of interesting position between those ideas. So I'm very curious to see what these artists are doing in 5 years' time. And it's quite possible that not everybody will be working at the same pace or with the same kind of intensity. And I'm also really interested to see how this exhibition series develops over 5 years. And I think it's really over 5 years that we'll start to understand its meaning. We'll start to understand how it resonates locally. We'll start to understand its legacy. And we'll start to see, I think, a sort of idea/image of recent creative work in this region. And so all of these things combined are sort of, embodied in the exhibition itself. And, it was a great experience. I felt ultimately that, I really wanted the first one to work and to be successful, because if it wasn't, it might leave the series in a slightly strange place. So I hope it works. And last night was really fun. It was really amazing to see 500 people in here engaging with the work, literally in some cases engaging with the work, talking to the artists and the artists talking to each other. And that, I think, was another important part of the story that I'll stop in a second, is that I think Lucia's idea is a brilliant one, because a lot of the people on the different MFA programs just don't know each other. They're geographically displaced. There aren't necessarily moments to gather. And I hope that the series, as it develops, create a greater conversation between the different MFA programs. And that's why we came up with this sweatshirt that two people are wearing at the front that have all of the acronyms of the 6 schools. So we've created like a new institution that just has an unpronounceable name. But yeah, thanks obviously to everybody at DC. It was just a real pleasure. And obviously thanks to the artists. And I think, as I mentioned in my curatorial statement, thanks also to all of the artists I met, because not everybody's included in this exhibition.
Thanks, Matthew. One thing, that last thought you had of just sort of the friction between the MFA programs and getting everyone together. I will say this has been attempted in Dallas several times by the schools themselves. Several years ago, probably 10 or so years ago, the MFA professors did create a series of exhibitions over in the frontier space of West Dallas, where Trinity Groves now is. All the warehouses that were over there were empty, and the guy that owned them, Butch McGregor, would give them over to whomever asked for certain periods of time. And so there were probably 3 years where the MFA professors were mounting these shows over there in the kind of no man's land of West Dallas. And it was cool because everyone would come in, and occasionally some of the sympathetic curators at the museums would get busloads of patrons and folks to come over and see what was happening there. But it did still feel that it was sort of in this echo chamber, like we were kind of talking to ourselves. And because the presentation was often in buildings like this, though not having had white walls put up and stuff, it didn't, the optics of it were always kind of scrappy and so it didn't quite get the friction that we had hoped, though it did make more community. And then it just sort of petered off because those spaces of like real estate venture are decreasing. We don't have as many places like that in the city anymore. So that was sort of another impetus to do this right now, is that we don't have those kind of places, those third spaces where something else can happen, and very much seemed like the moment for institution to step in and try and give space. I think what's been interesting in the city as well, not just the city, it's regional, is that a lot of the most interesting things that have happened, and Matthew, I'd be interested to hear your take on this from elsewhere, but a lot of the most interesting things to happen have been generated by artists themselves. So through artists' collectives, there was a moment also 10 years ago where there was a bunch of us that were in art collectives making pretty interesting exhibitions and mounting all these interventions. And the DMA paid attention to that briefly, gave a show over for us to do things. There have been spin-offs of the Dallas Art Fair, the Phallus Dart Air. I see Ludwig back there, which was freaking amazing, at a barbecue restaurant where you got a booth and you had to literally sit in a restaurant booth, and that's where the art was, and it was just funny and irreverent. So those moments of like artistic intervention, which have been for each other more than they've been for anyone else. And I think that's incredibly important too. And I think part of what I personally hope happens with this program is that these artists will have interactions with each other, which then build on some other activity that they generate and that is witnessed by others as well. But Matthew, I wonder if you can talk a bit about just where you've seen this kind of activity before, where artist-generated activations and presence have sort of changed an ecosystem.
I think in the the history of alternative art spaces, it's obviously about generational gatherings of like-minded or similarly minded artists, creating space for themselves because the space either doesn't exist or they're not being encouraged to participate in the spaces that do exist. I think what's interesting about this program, I think is quite distinct and unique though, is it's not so much about that idea of artist-led or artist spaces. It's the role of the art school. It seems to me that the role of the art school is somewhat under-considered and largely neglected within art history and within museum methodologies. And of course the art school might well be the most important part of the narrative of art. It's where it begins, it's where it's discussed, it's where it's tested, it's where it's challenged. But unless unless it's in an extremely famous art school like Black Mountain College or the Bauhaus or say Cal Arts with this extraordinary kind of alumni, there's very little institutional interest in art schools, and there's relatively little literature around the idea of art schools. So that was one of the things that interested me about this exhibition. It's an opportunity to start to talk about and think about what is an art school? How do art schools function? How do they distinguish themselves from one another? How do they operate within the specific local communities? And what's the legacy of that work in those communities, and so on? And it seems to me that as this exhibition series develops, I think there's a real opportunity to have a kind of sort of almost like art historical conversation around the legacy of the MFA programs in this region. One of the things we weren't able to realize for this exhibition, but it was the first thing I wanted to do. It's also probably one of the most expensive things I wanted to do. I'm a very cost-conscious curator, but on the wall over here, so basically as big as this illuminated wall here, I wanted to have a huge photo mural of a studio at a Dallas region art school, maybe from the 70s or 80s, when art schools looked different. So I wanted us to find maybe just one incredible image of people doing things at art school that would be kind of a sort of connection to the past and thinking about, the kind of sort of freedom that we sort of imagine existed in art schools at those times. But I was interested in kind of setting up a conversation between the recent past and the present. And we just didn't have that. We weren't able to make that happen. But for me, that's kind of the most, it's like the unique selling point of this exhibition is its relationship to art schools. And, obviously I'm not an expert in this region or its schools, but I've been to plenty of MFA programs, and they're just really interesting places. And they're not conventional academic spaces. There's something else, and I think this exhibition can and will speak to that as it evolves.
Abby, I wonder if you can talk a bit about, since you're sort of out in the field as a student yourself, the effect of this exhibition on your peers, and how you might account for it, as a curator and an art historian.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Sorry, I tend to project, so we'll have to accommodate for that. But I would say this has been such a great project for me. Before taking on this role and getting to step into curatorial practice here, really any of my experience in an institution or a museum is museum education. And I work at the Kimball Art Museum as well, very different kind of space, very different time period. And so stepping into the contemporary sphere was actually a large challenge for me in all the positive ways, but it was a way for me to expand my knowledge. And for me, working with all of you. I mean, I look out at this room and you're my peers, you're my colleagues, and hopefully I can say now you're my friends. And I really do enjoy that. I think so much of what contemporary art gets to be for me as I step into curatorial practice is really building relationships with each of you. I've seen how much of your heart and soul you've poured into your practice and how incredibly personal it is, but in a way that you're expressing yourself and inviting yourself, others into your own practice. And that's an extremely vulnerable thing to do. And so I, first of all, just want to thank you for inviting me into that and letting me be a part of that. I take that as a huge privilege and something that I don't take lightly. But I think getting to be a part of a project like this, and as Matthew said, when he did those 3 days of studio visits, some of his selections were works that were already complete, and then some of them, Matthew said, I like the potential, and I like what they're working on. And so I really got to be the person that was here talking to artists that didn't have completed works, that got to talk through and maybe be a sounding board for some of you. And some of you, I know we didn't have as much time one-on-one, and I know that will continue from here on out. But I think to see the excitement for us at this stage, being in graduate school, where I think we're all feeling the tension, whether you went directly from undergrad into grad school, whether you stepped away and came back, it's such a fruitful time for us to figure out and be in dialogue with one another and bring our unique perspectives. And I think see what is the kind of work we want to experiment with, and then how do we want to present ourselves as we move into professional careers, and how do we want to present ourselves to the world. And that will never be a finished project, of course, but I think these are really crucial times. And so getting to have these conversations with you, getting to see your work here has been selfishly so helpful for me as well. Getting to know what are the things that are driving you and matter to you, and how can I start to invest in a practice that facilitates that really champions you as the artist. I do believe that the arts are civic service. I believe that this institution has a responsibility to reflect our community well, and we can't reflect it if we aren't investing well in those relationships. And so there's just been an incredible amount of excitement, I think, from you all, for myself, to see what does Dallas-Fort Worth have to offer. I think it is tempting, and I fell into this trap as well, to look to the coasts, and that I grew up in Dallas-Fort Worth. This is my home. I'm familiar with it, and it's so easy to take for granted the amount of talent and skill and perspective we have here. And this project has just been so encouraging. It's been incredibly profound and moving to see the perspectives that y'all bring, and they are something that we should pay attention to, and not just Dallas-Fort Worth, but the entire country and the world. There are really important conversations that Texas and Dallas-Fort Worth brings to the table, and so I'm excited to see how that continues to unfold.
Can you tell us a little bit about your thesis that you're working on and how it just serendipitously relates so much to some of the work in this exhibition?
Absolutely. So my focus is contemporary indigenous art, specifically within North America. So for my thesis, it's big crunch time for me, but for my thesis, I'm focusing on the Apsáalooke artist Wendy Red Star, who is often known for her self-representational photographs. And what's so interesting for me, and especially in this project, is there's a statement from some of her earliest interviews, and she talks about her time in grad school. And she grew up on the reservation, the Apsáalooke Reservation in Montana, and moved to California to do her grad school MFA at UCLA. And she has this remark that when she felt homesick, she would go to museums, because that's where she could find pieces of home. It's where she could find things that were representative of the community that she grew up in. And I found that extremely profound and discouraging, and also empowering in the ways that Wendy Red Star is able to move through different places to deal with displacement. And I think Indigenous communities especially have very particular conditions that they are working against. But what I saw was this drive to create a sense of belonging in her work. And so a lot of what I focus on is actually her most recent works, where she takes photographs of different pieces of Upsalaga collections around the United States and tries to kind of rationalize with them and create a sense of home and a personal connection, so that even in displacement and dispersal, there's a kind of unity and an identity that she is very actively seeking out. And so I think what was so interesting with this show, and as Matthew said, there wasn't some overarching theme when he went in and selected the works. You were very much autonomous, 13 different spaces, but there are these really interesting threads that developed. And one thing that stood out, especially for me with my thesis work and how I've been processing contemporary art, is the idea of fragmentation and mosaic building. And I think you see a lot of those ideas in the works that we have here. How do we create a sense of belonging and home whenever that's maybe not a given? And if there has been movement or displacement, how do we, as artists, as humans, start to rationalize what our identity means, what it means to belong, what it means to be associated with a place? And so I think those kind of conversations I've dealt with in my thesis have been extremely informative of how each of you is dealing with what does it mean to be here in Dallas-Fort Worth. Like I said, your work is very personal, and it's very reflective of the particular conditions that we have here in the Metroplex. And so getting to go back and forth, I think, between those, my research and what you're producing was amazing.
Yeah, it's sort of, there was a moment when Abby and I were walking through the space and we were just realizing, oh gosh, they're all thinking about this, with this, like who they are, what they are, where they're from, what they're made of, and asked each other, is this just like a very particular graduate school question? Those, like, what am I, who am I, what am I gonna do? And I do think there's something very true about what Matthew said, which is that this is a departure point for so many of these artists. I think, that is the sort of parenthetical time in graduate school where you are really in the weeds with trying to understand what you care about, what you do. My professor, Cam Shep at TCU, would always say, like, try not to think about what it is you care about. Just know that that thing is always threading through every single thing you make. And when you step back from graduate school, when you're out of it, and you look back years later at what you did and what you're currently doing, that is true. You find a kind of thread through all of it. But there was a kind of resting with your personhood very much in graduate school, where you're about to set off on your own and not have to think about that maybe as much anymore. So it's interesting to see this whole group of artists, almost everyone, tackling those questions of identity and personhood and place and isolation and fractured memory and all of that, which is just like very much universally part of the experience of graduate school. So it's just sort of remarkable to watch. I do want to acknowledge that for as many of 13 artists coming out of this, there's the chance that this will filter. We could come back in 5 years and 6 of you may still be actively practicing, 4 of you. There's something that changes. Life happens. You can't maybe pursue things the way you thought you would. But I wanted to ask you, Matthew, because you started as an artist, you were trained as an artist, studied as one, and how do you find your curatorial practice in relation to that?
I went to art school in England in the mid to late 1980s, and I think a huge difference at that time has changed in this century is that it was free to go to college in the UK. It literally cost nothing. In fact, you got paid to go to college because you got a kind of stipend for being there. So the decision to go to college wasn't like a flippant thing, but it was very easy to decide to go to art school where there were ostensibly no career prospects because it wasn't going to impact you in any way financially. But I think the reason I went to art school, and it's interesting because it's one of the few published histories about art school, is that in the UK there's this extraordinary history of the relationship between popular music and art school. And there's a really great book called Art into Pop that explains those histories. And I was very interested in music as a teenager, And my interest in art developed out of my interest in music. So art school seemed like an interesting place to go for 3 years, undergrad, and just hang around with interesting people. And that's some ambition of my plans at art school, was to hang around with some interesting people for 3 years and receive this very modest stipend. And the minute I got to art school, I just met a lot of other really interesting people, many of whom are still friends to this day. So one of the closest people I met, like the week I arrived, was my friend Gavin Brown, who opened one of the most important galleries in New York in the mid-1990s, and he's now a partner at Gladstone Gallery. But we were at art school together, and we used to make paintings together, like collaborative paintings. And I think we made collaborative paintings partly because we didn't want to make our own paintings. We sort of enjoyed deflecting some of that kind of idea of authorship. But I certainly think for myself, even though I was at art school, my plan wasn't to be an artist. My plan was to be around artists, to be around art, and to eventually work with artists. And that was my thinking when I was an undergraduate. I made some art along the way, and occasionally still practice. I used to show with a really amazing gallery in New York called Murray Guy, and they closed about 7 years ago now. And I decided when they closed I would just take a sabbatical, and I'm still on the not making art sabbatical, and it feels fine. But I think to go back to some of the things earlier, art school is just such kind of like a interesting idea, and it really is somewhat under-considered. And in the UK, thinking about this exhibition, since the early 1960s, there's been a traveling exhibition in the UK called the New Contemporaries, and the latest edition of it just opened in London. And it's a national survey of people in their final years at art school, and it's an open submission, so you send in your images and it's selected. And it's always been a really big deal in the UK. David Hockney was in it, say, in 1962. Damien Hirst was in it in 1988. So it has this history of supporting interesting and important figures, but also the exhibitions every year reviewed in all of the national press. So the status of it is quite elevated, and it's one of the very few instances, I think, where we're seeing, going back to my earliest comments, about seeing work that's being produced on campus having a kind of public dimension, public reception, and then, a critical reception too. So I think that it's something that could be and should be developed more and elsewhere, not just here and in this region, but you can imagine if this kind of exhibition was taking place in, Kunsthalle-like spaces across the United States, we'd have this sort of amazing energy about this public relationship with art school and public interactions with, works at this stage. So the arts education in Britain's changed considerably because now you have to pay to go to art school, and it's completely transformed the demographics of who go to art school. So when I was at art school, without exaggerating, I'd say like 70% of my peers were from working class backgrounds, and I'd say that those numbers have been reversed in the last 20 years, as the cost of going to art school is just simply an impediment for a lot of people. So I think a lot of the sort of histories within British arts education and how it impacted other fields, whether that's music or fashion or other things, was coming out of this really sort of amazing intersection of people from different backgrounds who were meeting each other on a kind of sort of level playing field. So I'm very conscious. When I was in San Francisco in 2001 to 2004, I was at the California College of the Arts, CCA. I was very conscious of the kind of burden, the burden of debt that the students had taken on just to be there. And consequently, I think it adjusts people's expectations about what art school might mean. So they couldn't be as casual about it as I was, because you can't be if you're paying $50,000 a year in tuition or trying to live in San Francisco or wherever. So I think the dynamics around that are important too, and I think there's just so much work to be done in this area. It's such kind of fertile territory for art historical thought that, for the most part, there just doesn't seem to be a great deal of interest in.
Yeah, it's interesting because so many of the schools in this region, or at least two I can think of, and TCU and SMU, I'm not sure of the others, but are free. You go entirely for free, and which is why I was able to go to graduate school. And I think there is this kind of certain relationship to the cost of education equaling talent and or seriousness as an artist. So if you fork over $100K to go to Yale, you're a more serious artist than if you choose to go to graduate school for free, not on the coast. And so I'm very interested in those judgments of quality as well, and what they indicate about the kind of narrowness of the American art market. And this lack of attention and interest, and maybe just lack of real criticality around what's happening in the interior of the country, has in many ways narrowed what we're seeing on the coast. So, I mean, I'm just thinking how when the MFA shows are mounted at Yale and Columbia and elsewhere, there's a feeding frenzy over those students. Everyone pays attention because that's the next thing. And I don't think anyone knows when the MFA shows open here. So I think that's, and obviously the energy and friction, to get into those schools on the East Coast and the West Coast are far greater. I think that's only because people are already paying attention and there hasn't been a light put on them. But I'm very interested to see if because we're able to kind of create, witness in any way what's happening in our graduate schools here in North Texas, maybe that changes the inclination of a student from elsewhere to come here too. It creates competition between the universities here in town. It creates competition between students elsewhere. It's bait to be able to maybe more inclined to come to a school in Denton or Dallas because there's the possibility of having an exhibition in a museum. I think it's all a really interesting cocktail of things, but just the way that having opportunity and exposure as an artist, a young artist, builds your ambition. So if you're able to feel like what you do in that place will be witnessed, will be seen, may equal something later, may get you an exhibition, may get you a gallery, you're more likely to take a risk and do that thing. And I just think that's been lacking in this area. I think people have done it for the right reasons because they care, they want to be artists, but there hasn't been the ecosystem around them to support exposing them to a broader audience. So I wonder, as we sort of close out here and then open for questions, I'm interested in how you both understand the kind of wider art world that this group of students is stepping out into. What are the the kind of qualities of this? Not to make it market driven, but what is the art world they're stepping into? What are the changes you think you'll start to see happen? The challenges and maybe ways to encourage them. Matthew, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, I think the show's taking place at a curious time. The art world, as a general idea, is currently going through what could be described as a recession, and in New York, a manifestation of that would be a number of galleries closing. The economies for all kinds of people within the kind of the different roles people play within the art world are changing, and there's a kind of tightening of belts. And for me, that just means it's an incredibly interesting time to be making art. It's an incredibly time to be thinking about art. It's an incredibly interesting time to be putting art into the world because, we have historical evidence that every time there is a kind of recession or a kind of rupture in the larger art market, new things come through because new opportunities arise. So we saw that in the late 80s when the New York art market collapsed. In the early 90s, a whole new generation of art dealers in their late 20s and early 30s started to open spaces because real estate was more affordable. But there was also a new generation of who were kind of pushing against the kind of art that had been celebrated in the decade before. So I'm optimistic. I think some people would say that there's no real evidence for me to be optimistic, but I'm very optimistic about what comes next because I think I'm not promoting adversity as a kind of sort of learning or teaching tool, but there's something to be said for it. And this was certainly the case in the UK in the late 80s. I arrived in London at the end of 87. The summer of 1988, Damien Hirst and his cohort from Goldsmiths College organized an exhibition for themselves because nobody else was supporting their work. And they changed the whole course of British art and British art history for at least the next decade, with some problems, but that happened. And it happened very specifically because the economic circumstances allowed them to occupy spaces that previously wouldn't. And they had a kind of ambition that went along with that. So I think it's a strangely interesting time to be entering into the art world. I think, the commercial art world is for obvious reasons, largely focused on the coasts that Abby spoke to in New York or Los Angeles. And, I think consequently from my experience of visiting MFA programs in the Northeast, the relationship between those programs and the commercial art world is very sophisticated and established. So artists who are in their first year on an MFA program are already probably in conversations with galleries. And the galleries are in conversations with those artists through artists who are teaching on those programs or visiting those programs who those galleries represent. So those formal relationships between the school, education, and the market are actually pretty established. And there's good and bad things to that idea. The same thing, say, in Los Angeles too, which has a much more evolved commercial art world than it did even 20 years ago. But I think it's, it always comes down to the same thing. It's generational, and things only change generationally. So it's important that, I'm an old person now, and I didn't used to be. And it's important that I'm replaced, and it's important that generationally the graduating students this year, next year, the following year, gather around, their shared interests, their shared ideas, their shared experience, and their shared relationships with the world that they're working in. Because, the world that we're working in is it's most complicated during my lifetime. And I just turned 60, and I've never known the world to be this complicated. And that's interesting too. So we have to think about how does culture operate? What's the value of culture? How does culture, reorganize itself to address the current and future realities? So all of that put together, I think, just makes it an incredibly interesting and fertile time to be doing this. If everything was great, I think you'd have a lot of problems.
Well, I'm also stepping out into the mystery and unknown with you. So I get to be that generation doing that work. I think there is a lot that could seem intimidating, but the first thing I was thinking of was just, we have space to be unconventional. And I think there will be a lot of complexities to that, and I'm even trying to think, as Matthew's speaking, how do I want to work alongside you to create space to do things that are unconventional, and that will leave an impact on the future that we're stepping into, which is so complex. What are the statements you want to make? What are the statements that I want to come alongside you in? And I do think just that reminder that we aren't the coast, and we don't need to be the coast. The coasts are the coasts. And I think that's what I've been so encouraged by in this project, is I want to advocate for you locally. Even if all of you decide to leave Dallas-Fort Worth, you have something that is so particular of your vision and your experience that the coast doesn't have. And so I just want to encourage you and empower you in that there is a sophisticated system that I'm incredibly daunted by. I will be the first to say it. But I think there's something unconventional here that has a lot of promise. And I do think there's a lot of unknown. I think there's a lot of mystery, especially recently. And so just getting to figure out how are we going to work through that. And that could look messy sometimes. And that could be questionable. And we will continue to push through it, and we'll make it through. So yeah, it's a big mystery for me, but I think there's a lot of hope and potential in just recognizing that you have something unique, that we don't need to become someone else.
I just wanted to add one thing, and my takeaway from my 40 years in the art world is that there's no hurry. There's just absolutely no hurry at all. And patience is the key to everything that I've been involved with. And the goal, I think, if there is a goal, is how do you create or sustain a sort of interesting narrative for yourself and the people you work with over a very long period of time. And that's not like 3 years or 5 years, it's like decades. And for me, that's one of the interesting things about art, and I think it's one of the interesting things that drew me to art, is that it operates at a different pace to many other cultural forms. So I really like music, but part of what I like about music is its visceral presence and present tenseness. Theater, performative dance happen in real time. But one of the things I think about art is it's extraordinarily slow. It takes a long time to acclimatize to art, what it is. It challenged all of my younger preconceptions and assumptions. And it probably took me like 10 years to begin to start understand how art relates to me and how it might relate to art. So I think that there's no urgency, although my colleague Hans-Ulrich Obrist constantly talks about urgency. I'm less convinced. I think there's no urgency whatsoever in relation to art. And a very close friend of mine is the painter Peter Doig. We used to teach together at the Royal College of Art in the 90s. And he once said that it took him 10 years to make his first painting. And I think that's what he said. And I don't think he means it literally took him 10 years to make a painting. He made dozens of paintings during that 10 years, but it took him 10 years to get to the one that was the beginning of the work that we know him for now. And so that idea of a decade, it seems to me, is actually quite a reasonable amount of time. And when I was interviewed for the job at White Columns, which was 20 years ago, I've been there 20 years this year, I distinctly remember saying to the people that interviewed me, it'll take me 10 years before people understand what I'm trying to do here. And I think after 10 years, people started to understand what we were trying to do at that time. So advice, I'm not an advice giver, but there's no hurry. There's really no hurry whatsoever. You'll have interesting lives, different lives, things will happen. But along the way, you've got this kind of recurring event, which is your relationship to art. And it will change in really interesting ways too. But, that's my experience. And it seems to be the experience of pretty much everybody I know. And I think the goal really is to find a way to sustain this activity. And within that, there'll be economic challenges. I had lots of boring jobs before I had interesting jobs. But people always find a way to do the work they need to and want to do.